At 0600 hours, the transport and rail arteries linking Moscow to its western exclave of Kaliningrad were suddenly sealed. Millions of Russians and military planners awoke to a reality they had long dismissed. Poland had shut down all land routes connecting Kaliningrad to the mainland. This was not an announcement, not a diplomatic letter, but a cold, precise execution of logistics control. Every train, every convoy, every truck moving toward the Baltic outpost was halted before it could reach the border. For months, Russia had treated Kaliningrad as an untouchable strategic bastion. With its Iskander missile batteries and 1 million strong garrison, it projected power across the Baltic. Yet, the single strip of land known as the Suwalki Corridor, threading between Poland and Lithuania, had always been its vulnerable artery. Without that link, the entire enclave was forced to rely on the sea and air, through routes patrolled and monitored by NATO warships and radar. Poland's strategy was meticulous. It began months prior with a quiet observation of Russian traffic, intelligence on logistical schedules, and mapping vulnerabilities across the corridor. The move to close bridges, railways, and checkpoints was timed to coincide with heightened operational pressure on Russia in Ukraine. With its forces already stretched and supply lines under strain, Moscow was ill-prepared for a blockade from the west. Every kilometer of delay would cascade into fuel shortages, rations, and ammunition bottlenecks. The closure of the Poznan consulate, which for years had functioned as Moscow's intelligence hub in western Poland, amplified the effect. The consulate had monitored NATO rail movements, tank exercises, and troop rotations, feeding the data back to Russian planners in Kaliningrad. Its abrupt shutdown eliminated the last source of actionable intelligence, leaving Russian units blind to the movements of forces on their southern border. Analysts immediately recognized that this single act was the linchpin of Poland's broader strategy, to isolate Kaliningrad without firing a single shot. The economic impact was immediate. Freight that had been transiting through the corridor slowed to a crawl, with trucks piling up for tens of kilometers at Terespol and Kukuriki. Goods from China, critical to Russia's pivot to the east, were trapped before they could reach Russian markets. Shelves in Kaliningrad, already under logistical strain, faced shortages of essential supplies. Transit fees that previously generated revenue for Belarus and Moscow ceased overnight, creating ripples across regional economies. By the first day of the blockade, the logistical chokehold was complete. The northern Baltic Sea became effectively a NATO-controlled corridor, monitored by satellites, radar arrays, and warships. Air resupply for Kaliningrad was no longer a minor contingency. It became the only lifeline for critical military infrastructure. Yet even this route carried enormous risk. Each flight was tracked, each cargo visible to intelligence satellites, forcing planners to fly only during limited windows and under constant threat of detection. Kaliningrad's military planners faced a paradox. Their Iskander missile batteries, which had once given Moscow leverage over Europe, now depended entirely on supplies from Moscow that could take days to reach the enclave by air. Fuel, munitions, spare parts, and food all became subject to unpredictable delays. Meanwhile, NATO exercises in the Baltic amplified the visibility of any Russian movement. Poland's decision had converted the once dominant military base into a logistical nightmare, forcing Russia to operate under extreme constraints. The psychological effect was equally profound. For decades, Kaliningrad was treated as invulnerable, an outpost shielded by geography and alliances. Overnight, the perception changed. Citizens and military personnel understood that their supply lines could be severed at a moment's notice, leaving them isolated in the heart of Europe. Morale among troops was strained as command structures attempted to recalibrate under the shadow of a blockade they could neither bypass nor ignore. Poland's moves were also synchronized with the Baltic states. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia tightened their own borders, ensuring that no auxiliary route could relieve the pressure. The so-called one-for-all principle created a continuous chain of deterrence, reinforcing Warsaw's action. Any attempt by Russia to reroute supply through alternative channels became exponentially more difficult as every corridor was monitored and controlled by NATO-aligned forces. The closure was not merely reactive, but preemptive. Russian analysts had anticipated that minor sabotage attempts, like those seen on Polish railways in past months, might provoke a limited retaliation. Poland, however, executed a strategy that combined diplomatic action, intelligence denial, and logistical control, leaving no space for incremental Russian responses. By the time Moscow realized the depth of the operation, bridges were closed, railways blocked, and checkpoints fortified. The effect on Kaliningrad's civilian population was immediate but subtle. Essential imports, from food staples to medical supplies, were slowed or delayed entirely. Local stores began to report gaps in inventory, while transport companies scrambled to adjust routes. The blockade had created a sense of isolation akin to a besieged city, but without the dramatic explosions or visible military encirclement. Every day of delay compounded the crisis, forcing authorities to ration goods and prioritize military shipments. Supply chains dependent on Belarusian transit were equally impacted. Poland's closure of border crossings along the Belarusian frontier effectively trapped Russian goods in transit hubs, creating backups stretching for dozens of kilometers. Logistician estimates projected weeks of delay to reroute cargo through air or sea, a task made more difficult by NATO surveillance. The economic pressure was immediate, hitting both state-controlled enterprises and private logistics operators, raising operational costs to unsustainable levels. Meanwhile, the Kremlin faced an operational dilemma. To maintain its strategic outpost, it had to choose between concentrating resources on air and sea resupply or risking escalation by attempting landward force to reopen the corridor. Both options carried significant costs. Air resupply was limited in capacity and extremely visible, while any land operation risked direct confrontation with NATO forces, which Poland and the Baltic states had made abundantly clear would trigger defensive responses under Article 5. By midweek, analysts noted that Moscow's contingency plans were insufficient. The logistical pressure forced the reallocation of resources from Ukraine to Kaliningrad, stretching supply lines further and undermining ongoing operations. Fuel stockpiles dwindled, spare parts for vehicles were delayed, and rationing orders circulated within the military command. The isolation of Kaliningrad had moved from a theoretical vulnerability to an active operational crisis. Poland's approach exemplified modern hybrid strategy, the use of legal, logistical, and administrative measures to achieve military objectives without engaging in direct combat. The closure of bridges and border crossings, the shutdown of consulates, and the synchronized action with the Baltic states collectively transformed a traditional military stronghold into a region under economic and operational siege. The psychological and strategic effects compounded in ways conventional artillery could not replicate. At 0700 hours, the first Russian resupply convoys attempting to cross the Suwalki corridor were stopped cold. Trucks carrying fuel, food, and spare parts queued for tens of kilometers, engines idling, drivers unaware if they would ever reach Kaliningrad. Every checkpoint was monitored, every border crossing sealed under Warsaw's new security protocols. The blockade was precise, leaving no gap for minor rerouting or bureaucratic delay. For the first time, Russia's western exclave was operating on a schedule dictated entirely by NATO-aligned states. The military implications were immediate. Kaliningrad's Iskander batteries, capable of reaching targets across the Baltic, were constrained by fuel shortages. Air defenses required constant maintenance, yet replacement parts were delayed. The enclave's 1 million-strong garrison suddenly faced the reality of dwindling rations, restricted fuel, and limited reinforcement capacity. Moscow's command realized that maintaining operational readiness in Kaliningrad would now be exponentially more difficult. Poland's strategic calculation relied on precision timing. The border closures coincided with heightened operational pressure on Russia in Ukraine, creating a dual-front strain. While Russian forces scrambled to maintain supply lines in the south, the west was effectively cut off. NATO's eastern flank, led by Warsaw, had created a logistical bottleneck that forced Moscow to prioritize defensive measures over offensive action. The result was a strategic paralysis that extended beyond Kaliningrad. Meanwhile, Kaliningrad's civilian population experienced the first tangible effects. Grocery stores reported shortages, medical facilities faced delays in receiving equipment, and public transport depended on fuel reserves that were being rationed. While the blockade was non-violent, its impact was pervasive, creating a psychological sense of isolation and urgency. The city was no longer a safe outpost of Russian power. It had become a potential vulnerability. The closure of the Poznan consulate had magnified this effect. For years, the facility had operated as a hub for intelligence gathering, monitoring NATO rail movement, troop deployments, and supply logistics. Its sudden shutdown removed Moscow's eyes and ears in western Poland, leaving military planners without critical situational awareness. Every calculation about resupply routes, convoy timing, or operational security was now guesswork. Polish coordination with the Baltic states intensified the blockade's effectiveness. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia implemented strict border controls, preventing Russia from rerouting supply through alternative channels. The combined effect created an unbroken chain of observation and enforcement from Poland to the northern Baltic, leaving Kaliningrad isolated on land. Any attempt to break through risked direct exposure to NATO surveillance and rapid defensive response. In response, Moscow attempted to shift logistical operations to sea and air. Freight flights began ferrying limited supplies, but every sortie was visible to NATO satellites and tracked by maritime patrols. Sea convoys faced risks from NATO vessels in the Baltic Sea, forcing Russian planners to stagger operations and prioritize critical shipments. The air and sea routes, previously supplementary, now became the primary arteries sustaining Kaliningrad. The strain on Russian resources extended beyond Kaliningrad. Supply lines in Ukraine were also affected as Moscow was forced to divert logistics capacity to sustain the isolated enclave. Fuel reserves, vehicle maintenance, and rations were redistributed under increasingly tight constraints. The blockade, executed without a single shot fired, imposed an operational cost that Moscow had not anticipated, forcing strategic recalculation across multiple theaters. Poland's strategy demonstrated a modern hybrid warfare doctrine. By combining diplomatic action, infrastructure control, and intelligence denial, Warsaw achieved a military objective without direct confrontation. The closure of the border, consulate, and checkpoints created a sustained pressure point, forcing Russia to operate at the mercy of NATO-aligned decision-making. The physical isolation of Kaliningrad became a tool of strategic leverage. Within hours, the economic consequences became clear. Transit fees collected by Belarusian authorities vanished, goods rotted in transit hubs, and contracts dependent on timely delivery were cancelled. The flow of consumer products, industrial parts, and military supplies stalled, multiplying the cost and time required to sustain operations. Moscow was confronted not only with military constraints, but with a cascading economic disruption that threatened domestic stability. Air resupply, though operationally feasible, carried both financial and strategic risk. Every flight required fuel, crew, and security, while remaining fully exposed to satellite observation. The reliance on aerial transport limited the amount of supplies that could reach the enclave, creating a slow-motion crisis in which critical infrastructure and military readiness were under constant strain. The psychological effect on Kaliningrad's residents and garrison was profound. A city that had once projected strength now depended on tenuous supply lines. Polish authorities anticipated Russian contingency measures. Security fortifications along the Belarusian border were enhanced, electronic monitoring systems activated, and troop deployments increased under Operation Horizon. Tens of thousands of personnel were positioned at key infrastructure nodes, including railways, energy networks, and communication hubs, ensuring that any attempt at minor sabotage or logistical circumvention would be immediately countered. The blockade was therefore both physical and administrative. Kaliningrad's predicament highlighted the vulnerability of over-reliance on a single supply corridor. The Suwalki corridor had long been a logistical lifeline, assumed secure due to geography and historical precedent. Its closure revealed that even the most fortified military outpost could be rendered operationally vulnerable through strategic control of infrastructure and allied coordination. For the first time, Moscow faced the reality that Kaliningrad's military strength could be neutralized indirectly. The operational strain extended to human resources. Troops in Kaliningrad were forced to prioritize fuel usage, ration food, and reduce non-essential operations. Maintenance schedules for vehicles and weapons systems were adjusted to account for limited parts and delayed shipments. Every operational decision became a calculation under uncertainty, reflecting a logistical and strategic pressure that had previously been theoretical. Poland's hybrid strategy did not stop at the land corridor. Diplomatic measures, synchronized border control, and public signaling created a multifaceted pressure point. Russia's ability to influence decision-making in Europe was constrained, while NATO's eastern flank was reinforced not through aggressive military action, but through careful planning, alliance coordination, and strategic denial. The isolation of Kaliningrad became both a message and a tool, demonstrating the effectiveness of indirect operational leverage. The timing of these moves was also critical. Executed during a period of heightened Russian operational commitment in Ukraine, the closure maximized strategic effect. Moscow's ability to respond quickly was limited, and attempts to bypass the blockade through secondary channels were delayed or denied. The combination of timing, precision, and alliance coordination created a scenario in which Kaliningrad's isolation was absolute in operational terms, even without combat engagement. At 0800 hours, Kaliningrad's situation reached a critical threshold. Supply convoys were still stalled, air resupply was limited, and the enclave's garrison was operating on reduced rations. Fuel reserves were being prioritized for essential military operations, while civilian transportation faced rationing or suspension. The once secure outpost now resembled a besieged city, not through bombardment, but through calculated control of infrastructure and movement. Every decision inside Kaliningrad became a race against time. The closure of the Suwalki corridor forced Russian planners to rely entirely on sea routes through the Baltic, yet the waters were effectively monitored by NATO warships, electronic surveillance, and patrol aircraft. Every shipment carried risk, not only of delay, but of exposure to reconnaissance and potential interdiction. Naval resupply, which had previously been a secondary option, was now the primary means of sustaining military and civilian life. Strategic planners in Moscow faced a paradox. Concentrating resources on maintaining Kaliningrad's operational readiness diverted attention and supplies from Ukraine, where combat operations were ongoing. Every ton of fuel or ammunition flown or shipped northward reduced what could be allocated to the southern front. The blockade imposed a hidden operational cost, forcing difficult prioritization decisions across theaters of war. Poland's coordination with Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia amplified the effect. Border closures and intensified surveillance ensured that alternative overland routes were blocked. Air and sea were the only viable options, and each shipment required meticulous planning. The unified Baltic front transformed a single-country blockade into a regional logistical squeeze, leaving Kaliningrad increasingly isolated and vulnerable to delays or disruption. The shutdown of the Poznan consulate magnified these challenges. For years, the facility had monitored NATO logistics, troop movements, and rail schedules, feeding actionable intelligence back to Kaliningrad. Its closure eliminated Moscow's eyes in western Poland, leaving Russian forces unable to anticipate movements along the critical corridor. Every resupply convoy, every train, became uncertain, operating without precise intelligence on potential delays or enforcement actions. Economically, the effects were immediate. Freight stalled at border crossings, supply chains were disrupted, and transit fees from Belarus and other intermediary states ceased. Goods from China and other partners piled up, contracts were cancelled, and perishable items rotted in transit hubs. The logistical disruption rippled across Russia's European network, increasing operational costs and forcing Moscow to reevaluate its supply strategies under pressure. Psychologically, Kaliningrad's population and military personnel felt the impact acutely. The city's isolation created a sense of uncertainty and vulnerability previously unimaginable. Troops accustomed to reliable supplies were forced to ration fuel, water, and food, while civilians faced shortages in daily essentials. For the first time, Russia's strategic Baltic bastion was experiencing the reality of dependence on adversary-controlled logistics. NATO's presence compounded the difficulty. Surveillance satellites, warships, and aircraft ensured that any attempt to bypass the blockade would be visible. The risk of interception or engagement constrained Moscow's operational options. Air resupply required strict timing and coordination, while naval shipments could not approach without careful monitoring. Each operation carried high stakes, magnifying the impact of Poland's initial decision. Polish strategy represented a new model of hybrid warfare, combining legal authority, infrastructure control, intelligence denial, and alliance coordination to achieve a military objective without direct combat. By closing the border, shutting the consulate, and fortifying checkpoints, Warsaw created a sustained pressure point that forced Russia to operate on terms dictated entirely by NATO-aligned states. Kaliningrad was strategically isolated, not through artillery, but through logistics. The operational pressure forced Moscow to redistribute resources from Ukraine to sustain Kaliningrad, undermining efforts on multiple fronts. Fuel, ammunition, and rations were diverted to the northern enclave, delaying operations elsewhere. Logistics became a zero-sum game, where every ton allocated to Kaliningrad reduced capability in conflict zones further south. Poland had effectively created a dual-front operational strain. Kaliningrad's vulnerability highlighted the dangers of over-reliance on a single supply corridor. The Suwalki corridor had long been assumed secure, yet its closure demonstrated how quickly a fortified military base could become a logistical liability. Russian planners were forced to adapt to a reality where operational strength was limited by access to supply, rather than by military force alone. Polish enforcement measures were comprehensive. Border fortifications, electronic monitoring systems, and troop deployments under the Operation Horizon ensured that no minor sabotage or improvised route could bypass the blockade. Critical infrastructure, including rail junctions, energy lines, and communication hubs, was protected around the clock. The blockade became as much a demonstration of operational control as a physical barrier. The broader strategic impact extended across Europe. Russia's capacity to project power in the region was reduced, while NATO's eastern flank gained both credibility and operational leverage. Warsaw had converted logistical control into a form of strategic deterrence. Within Kaliningrad, every operational decision became a calculation under uncertainty. Fuel usage was rationed, vehicle maintenance deferred, and non-essential activities limited. Troops and civilian authorities faced daily logistical challenges, balancing operational readiness with the constraints imposed by the blockade. Each day of delay further magnified the enclave's dependence on controlled supply channels. Poland's strategy also created long-term leverage. The disruption of Russian logistics, combined with diplomatic isolation and regional coordination, sent a signal to Moscow that Kaliningrad could no longer be treated as an invulnerable outpost. Operational costs, risks, and political exposure increased, forcing Russia to reconsider its approach to the Baltic region entirely. The hybrid approach demonstrated by Warsaw was multifaceted: diplomatic, economic, logistical, and strategic. Without firing a shot, Poland had reshaped the operational environment, turning an ostensibly secure Russian stronghold into a region constrained by external control. Kaliningrad's isolation was total in practical terms, leaving Moscow to respond to the consequences rather than dictate the terms.